Hi, I'm Tara. They said I was the disgrace of this family and because I married a man who fixes engines, not fortunes. My mother's laugh cut deeper than any blade, and my father's glass shattered when he yelled I was nothing without their name. They thought I'd stay quiet, take their insults, let them drain every dollar, every drop of self-worth from me. But the day he walked in, wiping his hands on a rag, looking them dead in the eye, everything stopped. They didn't know I was done being their silent daughter, and they had no idea what I was about to do next. Before we dive in, let us know. Where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I promise, you'll want to hear how this ends. I parked a block away from my parents' place because the driveway was already jammed with sleek cars. Vera's Lexus, Dad's prized Cadillac, a couple of SUVs with dealership plates, probably courtesy of Vera's in-laws. Keenan shut off the engine of our old Ford, looked at me, and gave that crooked half-smile of his. I forced one back, checking my lipstick in the visor mirror, hands trembling a bit. Houston's spring air was warm, scented with cut grass, and for a second, I wanted to turn around, go home, heat up leftovers, and watch TV with him instead of walking into another night of polite family judgment. We walked up the sidewalk, Keenan carrying the pie I made, the foil crinkling in his grip. My mother opened the door before we even knocked, her eyes flicking down to Keenan's boots before pulling me into one of those hugs that feels more like a public performance than comfort. "Well, you made it," she said, stepping back with a wine glass in hand. "Even with your commitments." I didn't respond, just nodded and stepped inside, feeling the air conditioning hit my arms, the scent of pot roast and lemon cleaner mixing in the hallway. Vera was by the dining room, her dress hugging her like a magazine ad, holding court with a couple of her husband's colleagues. She glanced over, gave me that Instagram smile, and returned to her conversation without a word. The dining table was set perfectly, name cards written in calligraphy. Mine read Tara plus guest, while Vera's said Dr. Vera Campbell and Mr. Campbell. I swallowed, placing the pie down as Keenan shifted his weight beside me, his eyes catching mine with a quiet question. "Are you okay?" I was, and I wasn't. We settled into the evening, Vera's husband cracking a joke about how he hoped Keenan could fix the sink while he was here, and someone else laughing a little too loudly. Keenan only smiled politely, his hand resting on my lower back, grounding me while I laughed off the moment. I told myself it was nothing, just another micro-cut in a lifetime of small humiliations. Dinner was served on the patio under those hanging lights Mom bought after seeing them on Vera's Pinterest board. Everyone was laughing about some vacation plans, and I was chewing slowly, hoping the conversation would drift away from me, from us, but it didn't. Mom tilted her wine glass, eyes narrowing as she looked over at me. "So that's all you could get?" she said, her voice soft enough to sound casual, but sharp enough to slice me open in front of everyone. I felt Keenan's hand tighten slightly under the table, but I stayed still. My father's fork clinked against his plate, and he set it down hard enough that the china rattled. "You're the disgrace of this family," he said, his face flushed, eyes not leaving mine. "All that schooling, all those sacrifices, and you throw it away for a garage man." My face burned, but I kept chewing, kept my head up, staring at the flowers in the center of the table. I remembered the promise I made to Keenan in the truck before we walked up the path. No drama tonight, no fighting. So I swallowed the hurt, letting it settle like a stone in my gut. The air thickened, forks slowed, eyes darted away, and even Vera looked uneasy for a moment before she resumed her smiling, twisting her wine glass, letting her husband lean in to whisper something that made her giggle. I wanted to scream, to throw my napkin down and remind them that I'm the one who visited Dad every weekend after his surgery, that I'm the one who helped Mom when she had that dizzy spell last winter, that I've been paying off my student loans on a teacher's salary while they flaunt vacations and remodels. I wanted to tell them that Keenan treats me with more kindness than they ever have, that he listens to me, respects me, and loves me without conditions. But I didn't. I just sat there feeling the shame creep up my neck, the tears burning behind my eyes, my nails digging into my palm. Keenan excused himself quietly, standing up, leaving the table to grab something from the truck. Dad shook his head, muttering, "Can't even sit through a meal," and a couple of relatives chuckled under their breath. Mom topped off her wine, smirking. "At least you showed up, Tara, even with your commitments." I could barely hear the laughter anymore, the clinking glasses, the shuffle of plates. All I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears, the pounding of my heart, the scream I kept swallowing for years. And then the door to the patio creaked open. Keenan stepped back in, wiping his hands on a rag, the dusk light outlining him against the hallway behind. He stood there for a moment, scanning the table, his eyes finding mine before moving to my parents, to Vera, to everyone watching. And just like that, the laughter died. Vera's smile faltered, the glass in her hand stopping mid-air. Dad's face froze, the color draining a shade lighter. Even Mom's smirk slipped just a fraction as she set her wine glass down. Keenan didn't say a word. He just looked at them, standing there, calm and steady, like the eye of a storm that had been waiting patiently. For a moment, I felt something shift. The shame loosened, the fear cracked, and I wondered with a tiny spark of hope if this was the moment everything would change. Keenan finally opened his mouth, and the hush around the table grew heavier, like the air just before a storm rolls in across the Gulf. The backyard lights flickered slightly, and I caught the way Vera's fingers tightened around her wine glass, the soft click of her ring tapping the crystal like a nervous tell she couldn't hide. He didn't raise his voice, didn't clear his throat or shift from foot to foot like he was about to deliver some awkward apology. Keenan just stood there, wiping the last bit of grease from his hands onto that old rag he always kept in the truck, and met my father's glare head-on. "I understand you think I'm beneath your family," he said, slow and clear, each word a stone dropping into water. "But I've kept quiet out of respect for Tara." A cousin coughed. Someone's chair creaked, but otherwise, no one moved. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, and she lowered her gaze to her plate, pretending to adjust her napkin, but her hand shook. Dad leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his mouth twitching like he was ready to unleash another insult, but Keenan didn't give him the chance. "You call me the help. Maybe that's what I am." Keenan's eyes swept the table, not angry, just steady, like he was reading the room before continuing. "But the thing is, I've been helping this family in ways you never saw." I felt the air shift, the way a room changes when someone says what you've been too afraid to say. Keenan's voice remained calm. "When Tara and I got married, she was drowning in student loans. She never asked for help, never complained, but I saw the way she checked her account before paying for groceries, the way she worked late to tutor kids after school just to make the interest payments." Mom's head snapped up, eyes darting to me, and I swallowed, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. I paid off those loans quietly because I love her, and I knew it wasn't her debt alone. It became ours. Keenan glanced at me then, just for a second, and I could see the softness there, the reminder of why I married him in the first place. Aunt Carol shifted uncomfortably, and Uncle Ron muttered, "Huh," under his breath, but Keenan kept going. "And last year, when you had that hospital bill that Medicare didn't cover and you told Tara you'd figure it out, she worried for days, losing sleep over how to help." He paused, eyes on my mother. "That bill was covered anonymously, just so you wouldn't feel ashamed. That was me." Mom's lips parted, but no words came. Her hand hovered over her glass, then dropped to her lap. Dad's jaw clenched, but he still didn't speak, his knuckles pale where his hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "And the lake house," Keenan continued, his voice softer now, almost like he was speaking to them alone. "The plumbing issues that Vera's kids complained about, the leaks in the roof, the electrical work that was miraculously fixed before the summer. I did that. I didn't send a bill because Tara loves that place, and I wanted her to enjoy it without worrying." The silence was so complete that the cicadas outside felt like a roar in my ears. Vera's face had lost its color, and her husband's hand hovered near her back, unsure if he should comfort her or himself. Dad opened his mouth, but Keenan raised a hand gently. "Sir, you may call me the help, but I've been helping your family for years in ways that mattered." The words settled into the warm evening air, like a final note that echoed long after the sound faded. I could see the confusion, the discomfort, and even the shame that rippled around the table. And in that moment, my mind slipped back to the day I met Keenan. It was a Wednesday, late, the Houston air thick and unforgiving, and I was standing on the side of the road with my old Corolla, steam hissing from under the hood. I was in my work clothes, tired, frustrated, and close to tears, when a truck pulled up, and a man stepped out with a quiet confidence that immediately calmed me. "I can take a look if you want," he'd said, and there was no condescension in his voice, no expectation, just a simple offer. He refused the cash I tried to press into his hands afterward, told me to just pay it forward. But it wasn't the free fix that stuck with me. It was the way he spoke to me, asking about my job, telling me about his dreams of owning his own shop one day, about building something that mattered, something honest. In that memory, I could hear my own voice, telling him how I felt invisible, how every achievement turned into another expectation I could never meet. And he'd looked at me, really looked, and said, "Tara, you're not here to meet their expectations. You're here to live your life." Standing in the backyard now, I realized they had never seen this side of him, the side that was calm, deliberate, and deeply, quietly strong. Dad's voice finally broke the silence, low and rough. "You think that buys you respect?" Keenan didn't flinch. "No, sir. Respect isn't bought, but you should know who you're talking about before you call him a disgrace." He turned to me, extending his hand, his eyes softening. "You don't have to sit here for this." My gaze swept the table, Vera avoiding eye contact, Mom looking down at her hands, Dad glaring, but saying nothing. The weight of all the years I spent trying to please them pressed down on me, but somewhere in that heaviness, a spark of pride flickered to life. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't embarrassed by the man I married. I wasn't ashamed of the life we built together, and I knew in that moment something was about to change. Keenan's hand was warm, steady, like an anchor. In that moment I felt the world tilting. For a breath, I wanted to let him pull me away, to let us walk out into the warm Texas night and leave behind the tension buzzing like an electric fence in that backyard. But something in the way the porch light flickered, the way my father's eyes narrowed, made me pause. I let go of Keenan's hand. His eyebrows lifted just a fraction, but he didn't question me. He just stepped back, folding his arms as he watched me turn toward my family, who had started to move inside, clutching glasses and dessert plates, whispering like high school kids caught in a lie. The dining room felt colder than the breeze outside. It always did, with its heavy dark wood table and the clock on the wall ticking too loud when nobody spoke. I stood at the end of that table, looking at the faces of people I'd spent my entire life trying not to disappoint, trying to keep the peace. And for what? My father broke the silence first, shifting in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. "Are we done here, Tara? Or do you have more to embarrass yourself with?" My hands trembled, but I placed them flat on the table to steady myself. I need to say this while I still can. My mother didn't look at me, just adjusted her fork, pushing a crumb across her plate. I saw her lip quiver, but she stayed silent. Dad scoffed, leaning back with that smirk he wore when he thought he'd won. "You're making a fool of yourself, again." That word, again, hit me like a slap, and I swallowed down the sting. My eyes darted toward Keenan, who nodded once, telling me without words to keep going. "I remember when you told me to keep quiet," I said, my voice low but clear. "To keep the peace, you said. Don't stir the pot, Tara, it's better for the family." But that peace was only ever for you, wasn't it? It was quiet because I was the one staying quiet. Someone shifted, and I saw Vera's husband roll his eyes, muttering, "Here we go." I took a deep breath. feeling the fear in my chest shifting into something else, something sharper. I'm not leaving because I'm not ashamed of who I married. I'm ashamed it took me this long to see the truth about this family. My brother, lounging at the far end of the table with a beer in his hand, laughed under his breath. "Come on, Tara. He's just a handyman." I turned to him, feeling my voice sharpen like a blade. "You mean the handyman who fixed up the lake house you've been living in for free? The one you brag about taking your buddies fishing at, claiming it's your retreat?" His smirk slipped, and he shifted in his seat, glancing at his wife, who looked away. Dad slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "Enough, Tara." "No," I said, my voice shaking but louder now. "Not enough. Not anymore." I could see Mom finally looking up, her eyes glossy but her mouth stayed shut, her loyalty to Dad stronger than any truth hanging in the room. I turned back to Dad, who was glaring, his jaw tight. "Do you remember when Grandpa passed and you swore you'd keep his land in the family? You took out a loan against it, didn't you, to cover your debts?" The hush that fell over the room was suffocating. The only sound was the clock ticking, second by second, in the heavy silence. Dad's face went red, his mouth opening, but nothing came out. "You almost lost it. I found the overdue property tax notice in the mail by accident, and I asked Keenan for help because I couldn't watch you lose it while pretending you had everything under control." My voice dropped, but it carried in that silence. "Keenan paid it, Dad. Quietly. Without telling anyone. Because he respected you." Vera set her glass down too hard, the crack of it against the table making her flinch. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because it wasn't about you," I said, looking around at all of them. "It was about saving what mattered to me. Even when you mocked him, he helped you, helped all of you." Dad shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping. "You think this makes you some kind of hero? You think we owe you something now?" "No," I replied, my shoulders dropping as the weight lifted off me. "I don't want anything from you. I just want you to know I'm not leaving, and I'm done running from the truth." I looked at each of them, Vera's pinched expression, my brother's stunned silence, my mother's tear-filled eyes, and my father's red, furious face, and for the first time, I felt free. The room was heavy with the truths I had dragged into the light, and though my hands were still trembling, there was something steady in the center of my chest. I stepped back, standing beside Keenan, who slipped his hand back into mine, giving it a gentle squeeze. I felt him there, solid, the only person who had seen me for who I was and never asked me to shrink to fit someone else's idea of peace. I thought the silence would be the worst part, but it was waking up the next morning that really cut deep. The soft patter of rain against the window should have been comforting, but it only made the air in that room feel heavier, pressing against my chest as I lay staring at the ceiling. This room was never meant to hold a grown woman's regrets. The posters from high school still clung to the walls, curling at the edges, memories of a girl who thought if she was quiet enough, she'd be loved better. My old dresser was still there, the top drawer sticking the same way it always had, and for a moment, I almost laughed at how nothing had changed except me. My phone lit up on the nightstand, buzzing softly. Keenan's message blinked on the screen. "I'm here when you're ready to leave." I held the phone to my chest for a moment, letting the warmth of his words soak into me before I placed it back down. I wasn't ready yet. Not because I wanted to stay, but because leaving without seeing this through would feel like finishing a race with my shoelaces untied. A gentle knock came at the door, so soft I barely heard it. I didn't say anything, but the door opened anyway, and my mother stepped in, cradling a steaming mug of coffee. She didn't look at me as she set it on the nightstand, the scent of it mixing with the rain and the old air of the room. She lowered herself into the chair by the window, smoothing her skirt with shaking hands. Her eyes were fixed on the rain outside, her lips pressed into a thin line that trembled just slightly. "It's early," I said, my voice rough. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, still not looking at me. I sat up, pulling the blanket around my shoulders, waiting for the words I could feel pushing against the silence between us. She cleared her throat, but it didn't help her voice when she finally spoke. "Your father and your brother," she began, pausing as if the words weighed too much. "They're willing to move past what happened last night." I stared at her, confused. "Move past?" She swallowed, her jaw tightening. "But you need to fix this, Tara. You need to apologize. Say you were emotional, that you didn't mean it." I blinked, the rain outside turning into a blur as tears burned behind my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. "You want me to lie for your comfort?" "It's about family," she snapped, finally looking at me, her eyes sharp with something between fear and anger. "You don't understand what's at stake." I wanted to scream, but instead I let the words drop quietly into the space between us. "No, Mom, you don't understand what's at stake." She stood abruptly, her hands shaking, the chair scraping against the floor. "You're being selfish. This family has sacrificed for you." She left before I could respond, the door clicking shut with a soft finality that made the room feel smaller than it already was. The coffee sat untouched as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, planting my feet on the floor, grounding myself in the reality that everything I thought was safe had always been an illusion. A while later, when the house had settled back into its cold, rigid silence, I made my way downstairs. The floor creaked under my weight, a sound that had once made me feel safe as a child, letting me know where everyone was. Now it felt like the house was warning me to turn back. I paused in the hallway, hearing my father's voice sharp and low, like a whip crack. "She owes us," he hissed. "After everything we've done, it's the least she can do." My brother's voice came next, muffled but clear enough. "We just sign it over, Dad. She'll never know until it's done." They were standing in the kitchen, backs to me, papers spread out on the counter. I recognized the letterhead from the bank, the words "line transfer" catching my eye even from where I stood. A cold wave rolled through me, leaving a hollow ache in its place. They were going to use my name, my credit, my life, to patch up the holes in theirs. My hands curled into fists, nails digging into my palms as I fought to keep my breath steady. All those years I spent quiet, obedient, pretending their small cruelties didn't cut me, swallowing every insult because it was family, and this was what it bought me. I stepped back, careful not to let the floorboards creak again, retreating to the hallway as quietly as I had come. My phone was heavy in my hand as I typed out a message to Keenan. "Don't come yet. I need to finish this." The rain tapped against the windows like a clock ticking down the moments before everything changed, and I stood there, feeling the cold anger settle into something sharper, something that made me feel more alive than I had in years. I decided to let them think I was still that quiet daughter. I let them believe it as I walked back up the stairs that morning, the rain having stopped, leaving the world outside gray and slick. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that came with everyone holding their breath, waiting to see which way I would go. It was late afternoon by the time I finally stepped out of that room, washed up, brushed my hair, and dressed carefully. I pulled out a soft blue sweater from the back of my closet, one my mother had given me for Christmas years ago, a sweater she said made me look like someone who belongs. I pulled it over my head and let it hug my shoulders, knowing it was exactly what she wanted to see. Downstairs, the house had come alive with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of dishes, and the sound of my mother's voice, sharp and cheerful, as she directed cousins and aunts to the dining room. The scent of roast and buttery rolls drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the bitter taste in my mouth as I moved from room to room, silent, watching. She caught my eye as I passed by the kitchen, nodding once, a small, tight smile on her lips. Approval, it seemed, was easy to earn as long as I kept quiet and dressed the part. Relatives began arriving, stepping in with cautious smiles and awkward hugs, their eyes darting away quickly as they muttered greetings like, "Glad you're here," and "It's been too long." They acted like last night hadn't happened, like the entire family hadn't been split open in the dining room for everyone to see. I stood near the hallway, hands folded in front of me, watching them move around, embracing each other, laughing too loudly, trying too hard to keep the air light. I saw my father in the corner, talking to my uncle, his shoulders stiff, his eyes flicking toward me now and then as if making sure I was still there, still quiet, still playing along. Dinner was late, as it always was when the family gathered. Just before we all sat down, my father cleared his throat, tapping his glass with a fork, the sound ringing through the room. Before we begin, Tara would like to say a few words. I looked up at him, and he held my gaze, daring me to step out of line, to ruin this dinner they'd thrown to clean up my mess. I nodded, my face calm, and stood up as the room fell into an expectant hush. I felt the eyes on me, waiting to see if I'd embarrass them again, ruin their precious peace. My mother's hand found mine under the table, squeezing as if to say, "Now, do it now." I cleared my throat, letting the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable, letting them squirm before I spoke. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice soft, steady. "Family means everything to me. I'm sorry for any hurt I've caused." I watched as shoulders relaxed, as people exhaled, as relief passed across my father's face like a shadow lifting. My mother squeezed my hand again, harder this time, her eyes glassy as she whispered, "Good girl," so softly no one else could hear. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and smiled politely as the conversation around the table picked up again. Plates were passed, laughter returned, and it was as if last night had been wiped clean, as if I had never raised my voice, never stood up. They thought they had me back. After dessert was cleared, people moved to the living room, refilling drinks, chatting about the weather, about work, about everything that didn't matter. My mother kissed my cheek before bustling away to refill coffee cups, her eyes bright with victory. I waited until the chatter covered the creaks of the floor, until my father was busy talking about football with my uncle, until the house was distracted by its own comfort. Then I slipped away, moving down the hallway to his study. It smelled like old wood and cologne, the blinds half closed, letting in the dim glow of the porch light. I moved to the desk quietly, opening drawers carefully, pulling files aside, searching with practiced hands. My heart beat steadily, a quiet drum in the hush of the room. I found it in a manila folder, tucked beneath bills and old bank statements, exactly where I expected him to hide it. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the words, "Lian transfer." My name typed neatly, signatures forged in ink that wasn't mine. Attached were statements, debt amounts, overdue notices, all hidden beneath a smile and a nod, beneath Sunday dinners and birthday cards. I pulled out my phone, taking pictures of every page, making sure to catch the dates, the signatures, the amounts. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. I felt nothing but a cold, clear certainty as I slipped the papers back into the folder, placing it exactly where I found it. I paused at the doorway, looking back into that room, into the shadows of the man who raised me, who was willing to sell my future to save his pride. Walking back down the hallway, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The blue sweater looked soft under the hallway light, the color of calm water. I met my own eyes, holding the gaze of the woman standing there. No longer the girl who kept quiet to keep the peace. "Not this time," I whispered. And I meant it. I rejoined the family in the living room, sitting quietly on the edge of the couch, smiling when someone spoke to me, nodding when my father patted my shoulder. They thought they had won. I knew what I had to do next. That thought settled into me as I lay in bed, staring at the rain tracing slow rivers down the window, the soft gray light barely lifting the shadows in my apartment. It was a quiet morning, but the kind of quiet that felt like the air before a storm broke open. I got up, pulling on a thick sweater, the floor cold under my feet, and padded to the kitchen to make coffee. The rich, bitter scent filled the small space, grounding me, reminding me that even in the middle of chaos, I could still choose how to start my day. My phone vibrated on the counter, again and again, my mother's name flashing across the screen. I didn't pick up, not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop, pulling up the folder of photos I'd taken in my father's study. Each page was clear, crisp, undeniable, I labeled them, sorted them, and then backed them up to a hidden drive I kept tucked inside a book on my shelf. If they ever tried to erase the truth, I would still have it. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through me, and set the mug down as I drafted an email. My fingers moved with steady purpose, attaching the photos of the forged lien documents, the overdue debt notices, the property statements. I didn't sign my name. I simply typed, "You should know what's happening before it's too late," and sent it to my uncle, my father's older brother, the one who cared too much about family reputation to ignore a scandal like this. It wasn't even a minute before my screen blinked with a reply. "We need to talk." A small smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I closed the laptop. Let the ripples start. Let them squirm under the truth they had tried to bury under family dinners and fake smiles. The rain eased up by late morning, leaving the streets wet and glistening. I cleaned up the kitchen, wiped down the counters, and tried to breathe in the normalcy of small routines while the world I'd known was shifting beneath the surface. I could almost feel the phone calls that were surely happening across town, the rising voices, the demands, the panic. Around 2 in the afternoon, I heard the lock click, and the door swung open. My mother stepped in without knocking, using the spare key she still had, carrying a paper bag from the bakery she liked downtown. She placed it on the counter like she had a right to be there, like nothing had changed, her eyes sweeping the apartment with thinly veiled judgment before landing on me. "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice calm as I wiped my hands on a dish towel. She sighed, placing a hand on her chest like she was the one who needed comfort. "Tara, we need to talk." "Coffee?" I asked, already turning to pour her a cup. She sat down at the small kitchen table, folding her hands around the mug, staring into it as if it held the words she couldn't say out loud. The rain started again, tapping lightly on the windows, a soft, constant rhythm that filled the space between us. "We can fix this," she finally said, looking up, her eyes tired, her lipstick fading around the edges. "Your father and your brother, they're willing to forgive what you did, but you need to stop making a scene. Apologize, say you were emotional, and we can pretend last night didn't happen." I leaned against the counter, stirring my own coffee, letting the spoon clink softly against the ceramic. "You want me to lie so you can all feel better?" Her lips tightened, her eyes narrowing. "It's about family, Tara. You don't understand what's at stake here." I set the spoon down gently, letting the silence stretch, letting her fill it with her discomfort. "I know about the documents, Mom." The color drained from her face, her hands tightening around the mug so hard I thought it might crack. She tried to collect herself, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're confused. You don't know what you're talking about." I stepped forward, resting my palms on the table, leaning in just enough to hold her gaze. "Don't lie to me. I know exactly what I saw. You're trying to steal from me to cover his debts. You want me to carry the burden of your choices, just like I've carried every unspoken rule in this family." She opened her mouth, closing it again, searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, she hissed, "You're going to destroy this family if you keep pushing. Is that what you want?" "No," I said quietly, pulling back, standing tall. "I want the truth to matter. I want to stop pretending that silence is love." She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You think you're better than us now, don't you?" I shook my head, looking her straight in the eye. "No, but I'm done letting you all think I'm too weak to fight back." She grabbed her purse, her hands trembling as she slung it over her shoulder. "You're making a mistake, Tara." I watched her walk to the door, pausing as she opened it, her back rigid, her shoulders squared. She didn't look back as she stepped out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glasses in the cabinet. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It wasn't the silence of fear or submission, it was the silence of something new taking shape, of lines being drawn, of a woman reclaiming her voice. I sat down at the table, breathing slowly, the fear that had lived under my skin for so long finally loosening its hold. I reached for my phone, opening the messages from Keenan, reading his quiet reassurances again, letting them steady me. The phone rang again, buzzing insistently in my hand. And this time, I answered. My uncle's voice came through, low and clipped, asking me to meet him the next morning at brunch. I could hear the tightness in his words, the careful pause before he added, "Your parents will be there. We need to clear the air." I knew exactly what that meant, and I said I'd be there. Sunday mornings in Houston often feel heavy, the heat slow to lift even with clear skies. But that morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds in my apartment, reflecting off the wet pavement from last night's rain, as if the world was daring me to back down. I dressed with intention, choosing a soft blue sweater my mother gave me years ago when she still pretended to see me as more than a pawn in her quiet wars. It felt like armor, and maybe a reminder to myself of who I had been, and who I refused to be again. I arrived at the restaurant, a bright, bustling brunch spot they favored, where the clink of glasses and polite laughter created a polished background noise that made ugly truths harder to hear. My uncle was already seated, nodding once when he saw me, eyes unreadable. My parents arrived moments later, my mother brushing her hair back and adjusting her pearl earrings as if she were walking into a charity gala, not a staged family ambush. We exchanged greetings that were more habit than warmth, everyone speaking just above whispers, careful to keep up appearances. The server came by, pouring coffee, offering smiles we didn't return. My father leaned back in his chair, giving me a look I had seen too many times, the one that said, "Remember your place." My mother's hand fluttered to her collar, a small, practiced gesture, before she turned to me with that careful, public softness in her voice. "Sweetheart, you really should get help," she said, her words syrupy, eyes glancing toward the others at the table. "We're all worried about your state of mind." I felt my hands tighten around the coffee cup, the heat grounding me as I swallowed the sharpness that rose in my throat. My father cleared his throat, adding, "You're making up stories because you're unhappy, Tara. This isn't you." There was a murmur of agreement from a cousin down the table, someone I hadn't even seen last night, nodding along because it was easier than questioning the narrative being spun. I took a slow breath, steadying the shake in my hands, letting the silence sit just long enough for everyone to feel the discomfort they so carefully tried to avoid. I lifted my eyes, meeting my uncle's gaze across the table, and I saw something there. An understanding, maybe even a silent encouragement. I set my cup down gently, the ceramic clicking against the saucer, and leaned back. "I'm glad you're so concerned about my mind, Mom," I said, my voice calm, even soft, but each word was deliberate. "Because it's clear enough to record every conversation we've had, to track every transaction you've made in my name, and to document every lie you've told about me." The silence that followed was instant and sharp, cutting through the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversation around us. Someone dropped a fork, the sound loud in the pause that had swallowed our table whole. My mother's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without words, while my father's jaw tightened, a vein pulsing at his temple as he struggled to find a response that wouldn't make a scene. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small flash drive, setting it on the table between us with a quiet finality. "I'm done being your scapegoat," I said, meeting my father's glare without flinching. "I'm done pretending I don't see what's happening." They didn't move. My uncle's eyes flicked to the drive, then back to me, his lips pressing together as if he was holding back a sigh of relief. Across the table, my mother's hand trembled as she reached for her water, her knuckles white against the glass. I stood slowly, smoothing my sweater, letting my gaze sweep over each of them, memorizing their faces in that moment of exposed fear. "I'm leaving this here," I said, nodding toward the drive. "Do what you want with it, but know that I have copies, and I won't hesitate to use them." The air felt thick as I stepped back from the table, the weight of everything I hadn't said before settling around us like a fog. I walked past them without another word, the bright sunlight outside momentarily blinding as I pushed open the door and stepped into the heat of the Houston morning. My heart pounded, each step feeling lighter as I moved away from the restaurant, the facade of control they clung to cracking behind me. I didn't know what they would do next. but I was ready for it. I drove toward the family estate, the late afternoon sun low enough to cast long shadows across the drive as I pulled in. The familiar crunch of gravel under my tires didn't give me comfort, but I kept breathing steadily, reminding myself that I wasn't the same woman who used to walk up to this door with her head down. They'd asked me to come for a talk, but when I stepped inside, I saw the truth for what it was. My mother was perched on the edge of the couch, a glass of water in hand like she was attending a casual tea, but her eyes were sharp and cold. My father stood near the fireplace, arms folded, the weight of the family portrait above him making the room feel smaller than it was. My brother and sister were seated on the love seat, flipping through papers with thinly veiled impatience. Documents were spread across the coffee table, some with tabs sticking out like flags on a battlefield, and for a second, I felt the walls press in on me, my mother's past words echoing in my ears. "You're nothing without us." My father gestured to the papers, clearing his throat. "Tara, sit down. We need to address your recent behavior and your instability." I stood still, letting them wait, letting the silence work for me for once before I calmly took a seat, crossing my legs, placing my hands on my lap to hide the slight tremor in them. "It's clear," my mother began, "that you've been confused, and we're worried about your decisions, especially regarding your finances." Her voice dripped with condescension, every word measured to look like concern in case anyone was listening. My brother chimed in, "You've always struggled to manage things on your own. We're just trying to protect you, and the family's interests." The word protect stung, but I kept my face still, waiting for what I knew was coming. My father's hand slapped down on the stack of papers, making me flinch despite myself. "We're prepared to take over the management of your assets. It's for your own good." They couldn't even look me in the eye as they said it. The papers they wanted me to sign were slid toward me, a pen placed neatly on top as if it was all just a formality. I looked down, seeing the same handwriting I had traced in notebooks as a child when I still thought my father was a hero. "You want me to give you control over my accounts," I said, voice low. "You want me to sign over what's mine." My mother's eyes flashed, her lips tightening. "This is for your protection, Tara. You've made poor choices before, like your husband," she said, spitting out the word husband as if it were dirty. "Do you really think marrying a man who fixes cars for a living makes you capable of handling family responsibilities?" It was as if a cold wave washed over me, the bile rising in my throat as I remembered every time they smiled to his face while laughing at him behind closed doors. My father leaned in, lowering his voice. "Sign it, or you're on your own for good." I felt my breath hitch, the fear pressing in, the urge to run, to hide, to surrender and keep the peace like I always had. But then the front door opened. Keenan stepped in, wiping the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on me. Calm, steady, a quiet strength that made the air shift. My family froze, their act dropping for a split second as they processed his presence. "I didn't think we were expecting guests," my father said, the sarcasm brittle. Keenan ignored him, moving to stand beside me, placing a hand on the back of my chair in a gesture so simple but so grounding that I felt the fear ease from my spine. "Actually," he said, his voice even, "I think this concerns me too." My mother scoffed. "This is a family matter." Keenan reached into his pocket, pulling out a small recorder, setting it on the coffee table next to the stack of papers they had tried to push on me. "Funny you should say that," he replied, "because I've been part of this family long enough to know when something's not right." The color drained from my father's face as Keenan continued, "I've been keeping track of every conversation you've had about Tara's finances, about the funds you've moved without her consent, about the debts you tried to cover by using her name." My mother's lips parted, her eyes darting to my father, then back to Keenan. My brother shifted in his seat, the false confidence draining from him like water through a sieve. "And I've spoken to a lawyer," Keenan added, his voice calm but unyielding. "We've filed paperwork, and you'll be hearing from them soon. This ends now." Silence. heavy, suffocating, the only sound in the room the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Then a voice, quiet but clear, came from behind Keenan. Mr. Lawson, a family friend and an accountant who had handled the family's books for decades, stepped forward, nodding at me with a small, reassuring smile. "I've seen the discrepancies myself," he said, "and I'm prepared to testify." The room erupted in protests, my father's voice rising, my mother's hand flying to her mouth, my brother shouting about betrayal. But I stayed seated, watching the chaos, the fear, the anger, the realization in their eyes that their power was slipping. And then I stood up, Keenan stepping back to let me take the space I had always been too afraid to claim. "You don't get to decide who I am anymore," I said, my voice steady, my chest lifting with each word. "You don't get to steal what's mine, and you don't get to break me just because you can't control me." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was freeing. Keenan's hand found mine, and together, we turned and walked out of that room, past the family portrait that had once seemed to watch over everything, and out into the evening air that felt cooler, cleaner, and full of possibility. They thought they could silence me, but they were about to hear me loud and clear. A week after the brunch, the Houston heat had settled into a muggy haze, the kind that sticks to your skin, but I barely felt it as Keenan and I stepped into the law office downtown. Neutral ground, that's what they called it. A mediation room with glass walls and too many chairs, a table that felt too big and too small at the same time. Keenan squeezed my hand once before letting go, his eyes telling me what words couldn't. "You're not alone." We walked in together, my mother, father, and siblings already seated, flanked by their lawyer. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like walking through water. My father avoided my eyes, shifting in his chair, while my mother dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a handkerchief, glancing around to ensure everyone saw her grief. I took my seat across from them, placing a small leather folder in front of me, aligning it with the edge of the table, needing something steady in my hands to keep them from shaking. Their lawyer began, clearing his throat, going on about the concerns the family had, about the confusion over property and accounts, about wanting to find a peaceful resolution. I let him talk, the words flowing around me like background noise because I already knew the truth and so did they. This wasn't about confusion, it was about control, about the power they thought they had over me. My mother sniffed loudly, leaning forward. "Tara, honey, we only did what we thought was best for you. You've always struggled with big decisions." My father finally looked up, his jaw clenched, eyes hard. "If you would just sign the agreement, we can put all this ugliness behind us. You're making a fool of yourself, and of this family." That word again, family. It used to cut deep, used to make me fold in on myself, desperate to belong, to be enough for them. Not anymore. I took a breath, letting the silence stretch. I reached for my coffee cup, lifting it to my lips before setting it down with a soft, deliberate thud. The sound echoed in the quiet room, pulling every gaze toward me. I remembered the way my father's glass slammed down during that dinner, how it made me shrink back. Not today. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice calm even as my heart pounded. "I'm here to let you know exactly what happens next." My mother's eyes widened, her hand freezing mid-motion. My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I opened the folder, pulling out copies of documents, the ones they had tried to hide, the ones they forged, the accounts they siphoned money through. "I know what you did," I continued, sliding the papers across the table, letting them take their time to see their lies in black and white. "I know how you used me, used my trust, and tried to steal what wasn't yours." Their lawyer tried to intervene, but I held up a hand. "You can either sign the agreement relinquishing control over my assets and issue a public apology, or I will proceed with pressing charges for fraud, forgery, and financial abuse." My mother's face crumpled, tears spilling over now for real, but I didn't flinch. My father's hands clenched around the papers, his knuckles white, but he still couldn't look at me. You always said I was nothing without you, I said, my voice steady, eyes locked on theirs. But you're about to find out what happens when I decide I'm done being nothing. My siblings, who used to smirk and roll their eyes, now stared at the table, their faces pale, the facade cracking. They knew the charade was over. Keenan placed his hand over mine, grounding me as I took another breath. I won't press charges if you sign the agreement today. And I want your apology in writing, to be shared with the family you've lied to for years. They didn't speak, but their silence was louder than any argument. It was the silence of defeat, of realization, of knowing they couldn't control me anymore. The mediator leaned forward, nodding, and began to walk them through the paperwork. It felt like hours, but I stayed, watching as they signed each page, their faces hard, their eyes refusing to meet mine. My mother's hand trembled as she scrawled her signature, a single tear dropping onto the paper. When it was over, I stood, gathering my folder, feeling the weight lift from my chest, even if the scars remained. I looked at them one last time, my family who had never really seen me, and I said, "You don't get to decide who I am, and you never will again." As Keenan and I stepped out into the bright Houston sun, the heat hit me, but it felt different this time, cleansing, a reminder that I was still here, still standing, and finally free to live on my own terms. We walked down the steps, hand in hand, ready to build the life we chose together, one without their shadows hanging over us. For the first time in a long time, I took a deep breath, letting it fill every part of me, and I didn't feel afraid of what came next.